I want to begin by reminding you what we did last week. We didn't quite finish what I wanted to finish. The second half of last week, I gave an outline of the general architecture of DRT, discourse representation theory, which is the general framework on which the topic of these lectures, MSDRT, builds, and from which MSDRT inherits a number of the basic features. And very briefly, DRT is a way of doing formal semantics for natural languages, where you assign the sentences and other well-formed expressions and also sequences of sentences from a given natural language fragment logical forms, and these logical forms or semantic representations belong to a separately defined logical form language, a formal language with its own syntax and a model theory attuned to that syntax or building on it. And the general strategy is you have a way of translating well-formed expressions from your natural language fragment into logical forms from this logical form language. And the stipulation by the theory is that the meaning that the model theory for the logical form language imposes on its well-formed expressions, its logical forms, that meaning is then also the meaning of the expressions, sentences, and other from the natural language fragment that are translated into these logical forms. And as an illustration of that, I started and actually went through the entire construction of the logical form for a two-sentence discourse, the one over here, very, very simple. Joseph turns around, the man pulls a gun from his belt, and we noticed last week that the natural interpretation of this two-sentence discourse is that the event of this pulling of the gun in the second sentence follows temporally the event of the turning around, and that has something to do with the particular tenses and also the types of verbs that you find in these two sentences. And what we assumed was that we had already constructed a logical form for the first sentence, and this is a DRS. As I said, it's got, last week, it's got, like all DRS, it's two parts, a universe which has a number of variable-like entity or symbols that represent entities, and then conditions, constraints on the entities represented by these elements. These elements here, these symbols are discourse reference, as they're called, and so here we've got the discourse reference for a time, and it's located, n is always the utterance time, not always, we'll see, but here it is. So this says that t is before n. This means that e is definitely located in t, and this is the characterization that the sentence gives of e as this turning around by Joseph. And now, assuming that we've constructed this, we go to the second sentence. This is a syntactic structure, I'm assuming. So basically what comes when you do this in all detail is actually also a syntactic parser or grammar for the natural language fragment L that the sentence belongs to. And it's on the basis of this syntactic structure that you then build the logical form. And you do that bottom up, going from the leaves of this tree to the top. There is not much to be said about this, except that I've analyzed here this verb pull as having three arguments for the puller, the subject, and the direct object, this phrase again, and then this from object, call it, is spelled. And in addition, of course, like we already saw with this other representation, the verb here too is used to describe an event of pulling. And so there's actually 4 arguments here, and this is the referential argument, it's called, and that is the, so to speak, what the verb brings along. And these other argument positions you see here, that's the underlining, they are slots that still have to be filled by these satellite phrases here, the direct object, and then the from object, and then finally also for x for the subject of the sentence. And another thing to be noticed is that if you look here, for instance, or let's look here, this structure here, and it's true for all these structures, isn't actually just a DRS, but it's a DRS preceded by what's called the store. And the construction requires that very often we have to keep these referential arguments of these predications, like the G here for the gun, in store, because certain operations have to be performed on those, and it's only eventually when we get to the top that's called existential closure, all the remaining discourse reference in the store are transferred to the universe of the DRS behind it. So here then well, it's 1, 2, 3, too many, no, okay. So here we have the result of 2 things. Building the representations for these DPs that consist of a determinant and a noun phrase here, and then putting the referential arguments of those DPs, these are the referential arguments of these NPs that you see here, into the relevant slots. And that gets us to the following representation of the VP. So all these discourse references are still in store here, and then we have the conditions that we get from these different arguments together with the condition that's originally from the verb. And so then we have to do a few more operations to get the representation of the entire sentence. Here is this representation that we just saw for the verb phrase. That now first has to be combined with the information of tense. Tense is located, like in many of these syntaxes we nowadays assume, fairly high up. And it's this particular tense, the past tense, is here represented by a certain feature called past, and it's the feature that does the work in locating the events described in this thing over here. So what we get as a result of the next stage is something C prime, yeah, just say it correctly. So this is now what we get when we combine what we had for the VP with the information that this event, that's what the past tense does. This is another time discourse referent. It's also before the utterance time. And again, the event, now the pulling event is temporally included in it, and that locates this event in the past events, just as we saw for the first sentence. And then we still have to deal with the combination of what we've got here and the subject phrase. Here I'm really fluffing things. The treatment of definite description is actually quite complicated in DIT, and I've just abridged that here by saying, well, this P also has a referential argument, that's this little m, that represents whatever or whoever the reference is of this phrase, the man, and this condition just says that that's what m is. And then there is a final operation, that is this existential closure that I mentioned. This is a this comp node for main clauses in particular, simply is the instruction to do that. So what we get as representation for the entire second sentence is this, with all the discourse reference now transferred to the universe, and this is all the conditions that we already encountered. So the details of this are actually quite complicated. You have to really spell out exactly which rules are applied to build the representation of a mother node on the basis of the representations of the daughter nodes. That's the kind of compositionality that you have in a system like this. And the rest, that is what such a logical form means, that's then to be cashed out in terms of the model theory for this logical form language that I'm not saying anything about right now. It's quite simple and much more simple than the model theory for MSDRT, about which also I won't say very much. It's not something that's very easily presented in a lecture like this, but this is just a warning. Now, the real reason for actually going through this as an illustration of what motivated DRT is still missing. What is missing is a temporal relation between this event of the second sentence and the event of the first. As I said, this combination of these two past tense event sentences in this very simple discourse is naturally understood as second mentioned event comes temporally after first mentioned event. So what we really would like is a condition like this, in addition to what we had. That is the cross-sentential connection that the combination of tenses and aspectual properties of the verbs actually conveys to us. And so the question is now, what exactly justifies us in adding this condition to this representation of the second sentence before we then merge it with this representation for the first sentence and thereby obtain a semantic representation or logical form for this two-sentence discourse, for the two sentences together. And this is actually a very hairy problem. Originally, I wanted to say a fair amount of it. I'm going to make it very short in the interest of time. This is not a series of lectures about DRT, after all. Before I do that, another small point, but it's also going to be quite important for later on. When we started last week, I gave this MSD, this mental state description that you can give in MSDRT for what goes on in the head of an agent that walks along a street and sees, or thinks she sees, a coin lying in the middle of the road. And so she believes that that's what's there, lying in front of her, and she forms a desire to take possession of this thing. And then how does she do it? Well, she needs something like a little intentional plan, namely that of picking up the coin at the point where it is, so going to the middle of the road and picking it up. Here, you don't see any reference to times. And I left all that stuff out when we started, just to make it clear what the issue there was of the effect of this discourse reference that gets introduced here being taken over by desire and the intention. That is one of the main concerns of MSDRT. But let me just, for the record, say really a more full representation or description of the contents of these attitudes in the case we are talking about would be like this, where now all these predications, like for instance here this X is a gold coin, that's now actually turned into a description of a state of the X being a gold coin, and more plausibly for here, the state of that thing lying in front of the agent herself as part of her thoughts is represented by this little I. I already said that last week. And so what you see here then in this fuller representation of the content of the belief is that there are these two states that both hold at the time when the agent is in the mental state described here. That's what these conditions here express. And same here for the desire, and the intention is a little different. The intention has a content that is prospective. It's about what one wants to or is going to do. So here we have a time that's in the future of the time of the mental state, and an event at that future time of performing this action. So this is just to remind you of something that's going to be in the background, but is going to be important all the time. And that is that when we get to the semantics of attitude reports, as we will in the second half of this lecture, they are always in these descriptions of mental states as part, in those cases, of attitude attributions of combinations of attitudes, single attitudes or combinations of attitudes to attributees. We have, on the one hand, the time of the mental state that is being described in such a simple or complex attribution. That is the end that you see in these conditions over here. There is, in addition, there are the times or time of the various conditions that make up the content of these attitudes. These are well, here we've just the time of these two states, but here we've got a different time, one in the future of the time at which the state is held. And then, in addition, we will see there is also going to be the time at which the attribution is made. You don't see that here. So time plays actually quite an important role in what we do when we make attributions to the states that other people are in now, or that they or we ourselves were in at some earlier time. So keep that in mind. These three different roles that times play in the semantics of attitude attributions. So I've already told you this, so let me click on. So back to the question, what licenses this additional condition of the first event being temporally before the second event? This is actually a really difficult problem. The simple answer to the question was originally given by assuming that we have narrative discourses, which in English consists of simple past event sentences and past progressive event sentences and simple past state sentences, and the combination of whether the sentence describes an event or a state, and these tense forms then sort of can be formalized, and you just go, when you build the representation of the multi-sentence discourse or text, you go, as we have seen, from the representation of the first sentence to the representation of the second sentence, and so on. And these rules, like, among other things, if you have two successive event sentences, then have to be spelled out to give you the right kind of temporal and perhaps also other connections between the eventualities described in these successive sentences. So I'll skip this also more or less. I mean, many of the slides have more on it than I'm actually able to read out, but I'll get them put online again on the website of the course, and then you can read the stuff if you want to, and it should actually be understandable from the slides as they are in this sequence. So the problem with this simple solution is that, in fact, the temporal and rhetorical structure of discourse is far more complex and diverse than what I just said suggests. The important sort of breakthrough, as far as this is concerned, was the work by Laskaridis and Escher, who developed a branch of DRT or an extension of DRT, segmented DRT or SDRT, in which they make explicit to a considerable extent how the tense forms interact with aspects of interpretation that are quite essential, namely that you haven't really understood the text unless you've also established certain rhetorical connections between the successive sentences or other discourse units, such as narration is one of them, and that is the one that we need here to justify this condition E before E prime, but there are many others. So the real story here is much more complex than I can define. You get rules for the tense forms that must be sensitive to the rhetorical relations or discourse relations between the different parts. So one part will be the sentence or clause in which the given tense occurs, and the other part will be, say, preceding sentence, but so part of the interpretation is to identify which the pairs are that are rhetorically related and what the rhetorical relations between them are. So this is actually a really difficult and still not fully resolved problem, but all I want to say here is that the original motion, even if it was very limited in its execution, for constructing logical forms of sentence sequences, that which was one of the inputs to the general architecture of DRT, that was his idea. We need rules for tenses, perhaps in conjunction with information about rhetorical relations, that establish these connections. So in order to be able to do that, you have to have a representation of the antecedent discourse when you get to a particular sentence with a particular sense. Otherwise, you can't really state, let alone execute these rules. So that is why DRT is a logical form language with this additional incremental character. And that is just the same for MSDRT, as we will see in examples later on. So one more point, another motivation, I will just mention it, for DRT getting originally this architecture of an incremental logical form method. And that is, it's a story I like very much, and I've tried to retell it recently. It's an old observation about the passé simple in French that perhaps not always, but in many cases, there is a sense in which passé simple sentences introduce events into the discourse that behave like points, that have a kind of temporal punctual character. And so you might have thought that if you have a good model theory for your semantics natural language, you might actually explain in the models what these points are. That won't work. The events that we normally talk about, even if they're introduced by passé simple sentences, they really have extension in physical time, they have real duration. The intuition that they're punctual has to be explicated in a different way. You have to actually see, but then also make explicit that there is something like a discourse time, a time that's created through the interpretation or through the construction of the logical form of a discourse. And for discourses that are really like proper sequential narratives with the kind of sentences we have already considered today and last week, you can actually then show, if you get the right representations of the successive segments of this discourse for which you build the representation, these representations that DRT postulates actually in a natural way project to a discourse time, a very small and rough discourse time structure. And you can then show, if you work this out with a certain construction that was originally used for a very different purpose by Bertrand Russell and his then assistant Norbert Wiener, that the events that are introduced by the passé simple in such a discourse actually occupy a single instant of this discourse time, not the real time that the discourse is about, but the time that is created by the particular way in which the discourse is formulated. So that's another reason for actually wanting representations and wanting them to be in a very specific form. End of this discussion. And with that, I also conclude this discussion of DRT. Keep in mind the main architectural features that I've mentioned. So now we get finally back to MSDRT. And I already showed you these two representations. The one that I just repeated earlier on was the belief and the desire and the intention, and then another representation, other MSD, where we had an additional entity representation. Entity representation is going to be very important, as I said, but we'll come to that, and it's mostly in the last two lectures, next week and the week after, that the big players will be the entity representations. So, originally MSDRT was designed, as I already said at the beginning, to provide a semantics for attitude attributions that are not just statements of John believes that it's raining, or Mary believes that Bill is in Berlin, or things like that, where you have just one attitudinal verb. Here, believes could also be desire. A lot of what we do when we make attributions is actually much more complicated and involves several propositional attitudes, like a belief and a desire to explain why the agent did, sort of thing that we want to have an explanation for. So it's really as an account of the semantics of such complex attitude attributions that MSDRT was originally designed, and that in particular these MSDs, of which we just saw a few examples so far, play a central role. So the remainder of today will be about how this works for, again, a very simple example, and will lead up to that in stages. Here, at one point, I'll click through it, but so it's actually sometimes going to be useful to distinguish between attitude attributions, as I use the term. Those can be thoughts in the mind of someone, the attributor, or they can be actual utterances that the speech acts, that the attributor performs. And I'll use the term attitude report just for the cases where we are dealing with an utterance rather than just a thought. But part of the whole story that I'm telling here is that the utterances and the thoughts are very closely related to each other, and that in many cases the semantics of the utterance should actually run via the semantics of the thought. So here a few quite simple examples. Well, basically two that we'll be concerned with. There's John believes that it's raining. And then the only example of what MSDRT is really about is this last one, where you have a two-sentence discourse. John believes that it's raining, and he hopes that it will stop raining. And so the other examples, B, C, D here, are just variants of the first one. I've added those in order to show something that I already mentioned a moment ago, namely that these different times play a significant part in the content of attributions and the thoughts behind them. So we'll say a little bit about how this one with the past tense here differs from the first one, and how this one and this one, believe that it was raining and believe that it is raining, differ from the first two and from each other. And so then the main concern will be with the construction of the representation of these this two-sentence, two-attitude attribution. So we start then with the first one. John believes that it's raining. Here is the syntactic structure we assume for it. There is one thing that deserves comment. So this is more or less the sort of thing we've already seen. The verb believe is analyzed here as an attitude verb, or attitudinal verb, in a sense that is quite specific in a number of different ways. It's just a decision that is part of the analysis that MSDRT offers. The first one is that it's actually analyzed as a simple transitive verb with a subject, that's the attribute T, and a direct object DP. It's just that the direct object DP is very restricted in the forms it can take. It can be a DP in an ordinary sense, like, example here. So, where is it? So, yeah, examples. She believes that too, so there the DP is just a single that. Or never believe anything he says. There the DP is this phrase, anything he says, and so on. And so the cases where we have as direct object of belief one of these that clauses, the best way to get everything to fit in a natural way together is, I've found, to take the DP in this case to be the combination of this almost clausal structure, it only goes up to a TP in the analysis I've given it, and this that which actually makes a DP out of it, and what that means semantically we'll see. So that's the one feature that's important, and the crucial point, something that we'll go over, it will take some time to go over, is exactly how the meaning of the verb believe here is combined with what we take to be the semantics of this direct object DP. So here, first, this direct object DP, now a little bigger. So we have to actually build the semantics, the semantic representation for that also. That is a little awkward. And the reason is that, what do we have here? It is raining. This is progressive form. Actually, a progressive form doesn't do much in this particular case. Progressive is really important when you have an event verb. The difference discussed endlessly in the literature between he built a house and he was building a house, where in the latter case, that doesn't mean that the house gets completed. It doesn't entail that the house gets completed in the end. I wanted to have a natural example, and I also wanted to avoid any noun phrases in this. So we only have this dummy it, and what we get as semantics, where are we? For this DP, I've not gone through most of all the steps, because they're very much like the steps we saw before, and they're really it's all part of DIT. But so the representation for the semantics of this complement of that is what you see here. It's about a state. These progressives always describe states on this, according to this part of DIT that I'm taking over. There's an MSDRT analysis, and more generally an MSDRT. So this just says it's a little bit different from what we saw before, but there's the location time T prime. That's the present tense locates that at the time n. Remember, this is going to be the time at which the attribute T is in the state of which this belief is so far the only constituent that's mentioned. And this structure over here that, I don't want to go into details. It basically means that we have an event abstract here that of being an event of it's raining, and that you abstract in an intentional fashion over that. That's what this little hat means, what you find in Montague already, basically. And the prog is analyzed as a predicate of such event abstracts, and its referential argument is a state, so the state is, in this case, the state of its being the case it's raining. So there's a lot of stuff that's actually not quite necessary for the rest of the story, but I thought I should just mention it. And so there, then again, that's the representation of this TP. That was the complement of that in the structure you saw. Now, the that actually is analyzed in this way as a sort of dummy also. It's a kind of link between the verb and this TP. I don't give it, in this analysis that I'm presenting here, a separate meaning. But the crucial thing is how this TP gets combined with the verb believe. And now here we get to something that's absolutely central to MSDRT. This is a lexical entry, the lexical entry for this attitudinal verb believe. It's analyzed, as I said, as something, oops, sorry, I get that wrong, it's very difficult for me. So this is the entry, the belief describes a state, and it's got these two arguments, the believer and the thing believed. And the semantics consists in saying, well, this belief is treated as a kind of operator on this DP, or actually this is this TP meaning we saw a moment ago. And this arrow means that what belief does is transform this combination into the representation of the mother node, the VP here, and that mother node, the semantics of that looks like this. Now, this doesn't look like anything you can understand if you haven't been told. So I'm going to tell you now. So what this says is that S is a state of this predication holding. And the predication is, the predicate is this at. This at is absolutely central in MSDRT. It's got 4 arguments, and the arguments are of rather special kinds. So the first is not very surprising. That's for the haver of the mental states, that is the attribute T. The second, well, actually, that is the first, so that's the second argument. The third argument is a set, that's a set brackets. In this particular case, the set contains just a single item, which is this representation of the belief that's being attributed by the sentence. So it's got this bell as indicator as a belief, and then we got this stuff, I've abbreviated in this way, but it's basically what we got as representation for the TP, that's the complement of that. And then there is a fourth component that I can't say very much about right now. It will come later, but its role is to actually link certain discourse references that occur in the third component with things outside. So anything more that I would say would just confuse you more. So this then has to be instantiated, this lexical semantics, for believe, and I will come back to these slides in a minute, but here you see the result. So the middle part, which is now filled in by this DP meaning, is what you see here. This is, again, this MSD with only a single constituent, namely this belief constituent, and the content of that belief constituent is this DP, a logical form that we saw a moment ago. And in this particular case, the link, normally this is a set with one or more elements, but it can also be empty. In this case, it's empty, so don't bother about it. And so what we've got here then, as now representation of the upper verb phrase, believe that it is raining, is what you see here. The new discourse reference for the state is put in the stall, and then this is just one condition of this DRS that gets introduced. So there are no discourse reference up here, and there's only one condition in its condition set, and that is this at predication that says of the agent, that he still has to be put in there, that she is in a mental state that, probably among other things, contains this particular propositional attitude, this in the formal sense of the word, this condition here as its only constituent. And then we have to go on. I wanted to go back very briefly. I've already said this, but is this the slide I wanted? Yeah, well, it's not actually what I wanted right now, but I should also say this. So this at predicate is absolutely central, just as central as the MSDs to the whole enterprise. And you might say it's a kind of the thing that closes the circle between DRT and MSDRT. So far, we only saw DRT in action as providing these descriptions of the contents of these different attitudes, like of the belief we saw so far. But these MSDs, by themselves, they're not really DRSs. You have to somehow integrate those into the formalism of DRT so as to get the right kind of way of representing full attitude attributions, full attitude reports. And that's what this attitude predicate does. And we'll see, so what we'll see then, again, going back to, I'll go one more here. This is the result that we get when we finish the representation computation for the entire sentence. We had this representation you just saw for the upper VP, and the rest is then what you've seen before. So we get the tense, and the tense is present, so that leads this T with a T equals N, and this S including this T, so S including N, and then we have, this is just a simple version of proper names, this proper name for with its referential arguments for the attribute T. So this is the representation we get for the sentence, John believes that it's raining. And it's the at predication that allows us to do what we want to do with MSDs, like in this particular case, this very simple one. So that is the moral here. The formalism of MSDRT consists crucially, on the one hand, of the means it makes available for these MSDs, these descriptions of mental states, and then this at predicate that allows you to insert these MSDs in an intuitively and semantically sound way into DRSs, where these at predications are just one among the various types of DRS conditions you could have. So, that was the construction for the logical form of this first sentence. And to repeat, I mean, the crucial thing is to get the connection between the beliefs and that it's raining here. The other three sentences here are just variants, as I said. To get the representation for this second sentence is actually quite straightforward. It just means that here you have now got a past tense instead of a present tense, and the rest is just the same as before. So let me see. So this is the representation of that sentence. The only difference is in here that you've got the T prime for the end. That's not very interesting, but it's a fact worth observing. The other two sentences are a very different cup of tea. So let me see, do I have them here? So here, this is the sentence, John believed it was raining. This is one of these sentence types that have actually been studied by people who are interested in tense and aspect extensively, and it's often described as past under past. And the point is that if you have an English sentence like that, with a past tense here and a past tense there, and the complement here is actually state-like. It's like a condition that can hold surrounding some particular location time, as we've seen. Then the time of this content here is normally understood as simultaneous with the time here, the past tense, of the matrix verb. There is nothing that I've said that actually suggests that. And in fact, that English and a number of other languages, like French, I'm not wrong, especially European languages, behave this way, that they can express simultaneity between the content of the belief and the actual state of believing it in this way. That's got something to do with the tense system of these languages. These are often described as sequence of tense or consecutio temporum languages. And so a special regime will be needed to actually state exactly how we get this content here when we process this particular sentence. That's got to do with this special feature of English past tenses. And it's also important, this connection, to note something that I haven't said yet. I talked about n as representing the utterance time earlier. But I also said at some point that n was the state, the time of at which an agent is in a particular mental state. And that's the role of this n over here. This is the psychological presence of the agent at the time where the agent is said to be in this state that's given by this S over here. So it's a different time from that one. The N over here is the same time as the T over here. And that is actually sort of awkward. It seems to have this symbol N that does different things in different positions. It's actually very difficult to get rid of it. And I leave it like this, but be alert to the fact that quite often N is not the utterance time, but it is some other time that has to do with the psychological presence of an agent. So, that is the third of these four sentences. The last one is up here. John believed that it is raining. That's another puzzle about the tense system of these consecutio temporum languages. When they have a present under past, then that present is typically interpreted as what's described as double access. And it means that the state that's being described here is supposed to hold both at the time of the belief that's being reported here and at the time at which the utterance, the attitude report is made. Again, that's a story in its own right. The reason why I'm making this observation in the last one, is to actually stress the following. Let me just first show you. That's the information that has to do with the double access, this S prime holding both at the time when the state was there and at the time of the did I get something wrong? So it has to, sorry. So what this should be, I'll check this later, is actually, this should say that the state of its raining should hold both at the utterance time and at the time of the reported state, which is before the utterance time. So the reason for making these observations, which are sort of special to the language in question, in this case is English, is to stress the following. The logical forms that MSDRT makes available, they are, I'm claiming, what we want in general to represent both the thoughts that people have when they attribute thoughts to others, and the ways in which they express these thoughts when they make attitude reports. Precisely how the tense forms and maybe other things in the sentence contribute to the times that occur in these temporal relations that occur in the resulting logical forms is a matter of the syntax semantics interface for these particular languages. But it's independent of how we think, whichever language we speak, of the meaning of attitude attributions. So MSDRT makes this separation very clearly, and I claim that that is actually an advantage because a lot of the stuff that I know of about the tenses of embedded clauses with attitudinal verbs and also verbs of saying are actually not quite right and sometimes a little confused. So that's the moral of this. The last part, and we'll just about get through that, is the final and the only two attitude reports. John believes that it's raining and he hopes that it will stop raining. Now, this is the representation we got for the first sentence, so that doesn't change. And now we turn to the second hope attribution. The syntactic structure for the second sentence is just like the one before. Hope, to, is analyzed as an attitudinal verb, both qua syntax and also, as you will see, qua semantics. So here, before we can actually get to that point, we have to say a few words about the this TP structure of the complement of hope. That has now, so he hopes that it stops raining. Stop is a presupposition trigger, and that's in fact an important part of the point of this example, and we need to represent it. So presupposition is a very important thing within DRT, and a special notation has been developed to deal with it, and I should just show you how it works. So when you have an item in a sentence that triggers a presupposition, the presupposition has to be, as part of constructing the semantic representation, spelled out explicitly. And exactly what it is depends, of course, on the trigger. In this particular case, what does stop do? It presupposes that a certain condition was going on and then says of a certain time, that's what the stop does, that condition comes to an end at that point. So that's what you see here very briefly, because we haven't got much more time left. So the condition here is this condition of it's raining. That is presupposed by stop raining, and then the non-presuppositional part says that as a result of the event that stop raining introduces, that's this E over here. E is a transition from this earlier state to the contrary state. The contrary state is that of it not raining, and that is expressed here. It's a bit complicated in DRT. Basically, it says that this state of not raining is a state that doesn't contain temporally any state of its raining. So it's not raining throughout the duration of this thing. So that's now the representation that we get for the content of the hope. And so now the point then is, when we combine that with the lexical semantics for hope, that's also an attitudinal verb. It also uses an at predication, again, now with of the type hope rather than belief. And so, yeah, let me go back 1 minute. So in here, we've got this semantics, this logical form for the that complement with this presupposition. And so when we combine this contribution of hope with that, then we get a representation where we still have this presupposition sitting there. So I also, for complete sake, I haven't done it before, treat the pronoun he in the subject position, he hopes, as a presupposition trigger, like personal pronouns are, anaphoric pronouns are presupposition triggers of a certain kind. This Z with a question mark means I have to find in my discourse context a discourse referent that fits this. And of course, in this particular case, where the discourse context is the representation of the first sentence, that will be the discourse referent J for John. But so when we now have this as representation for the second sentence, you still have all this stuff in here that you don't see, but it's now a representation that's the discourse representation structure, DRS, and it has now this, in addition, this presupposition for the subject on the outside. And let me just click through this. Here you see, I should go back one moment. Sorry, I'm going to the wrong direction. Sorry. What happens now? How do we justify in particular these two presuppositions, this one over here, and the stop presupposition is in there? Now, the natural resolution of this he is to John, as I said. When we do that, then we are in the following situation. We have now these two representations for the two sentences. They both contain at predications. The first one for the belief and the second one for the hope. And these two at predications are the same, both with respect to the agent, it's now John in both cases, and with respect to the time, which in this case is, in both cases, the utterance time. In such a situation, you can simply amalgamate the MSDs in these two attitude predications into a single one. I mean, after all, what it all says is that John is in a mental state that has both the belief and the hope. And so that is what, so this is, yeah, exactly. So this is where we have put the hope and the belief into the, into the third slot of a new attitude predication that says that John is now in a state that has both these two attitudes. And now we are one step closer to a justification of why we can use this over here, the content of the belief, to justify this presupposition over there, the stop. There is one final point that has to be made, though, and that is that this works all right in the present case because the part that contains the presupposition that we have to resolve is a hope, and the part we would like to use for the resolution is a belief. Contents of beliefs may be used in the resolution of presuppositions in something of the type hope. But it's crucial that the mode indicators of these two attitudes are those particular ones, more generally that the mode indicators stand in the right relation to each other. And so what, click through it quickly, so here we've got the final representation where the presupposition has disappeared, so it's a single at predication with the belief and the hope without presuppositions, and the crucial thing is that in order for such resolutions to be possible, I repeat myself, the mode indicators of these two parts, with the presupposition and with the justification, must stand in the right relation, and this relation, or these relations are described in MSDRT as the attitudinal hierarchy. So the attitudinal hierarchy is a set of pairs of mode indicators, mod 1 and mod 2, and the pairs in that relation are those where the content of an attitude with this indicator may be used to resolve presuppositions of an other attitude with this indicator that's part of the same MSD. So exactly which pairs of mode indicators stand in this relation is actually not very easy to determine. For some cases, perfectly plain. If you have a belief with some presuppositions, another belief that justifies these presuppositions, that is one of these cases where it's all right. Bell des, bell int, bell hope, all these cases where bell is the first mod indicator are fine. But if you turn those around, you have a desire, and you can't really, on the basis of what the desire is, and for belief. I mean, people do occasionally, but that is sort of self-deception, in fact. So there's a real task to see exactly how, which of these mode indicative pairs license this kind of using the one for resolving presuppositions in the other. I must stop here, and before I say thank you, here, and this is all sort of hard stuff, and I hope I've given you an impression of how it works, but I took my task here to be that of giving you the formal ins and outs to some extent, to see that what is coming now in the next two lectures, which is much more fun. It's the sort of fun you are doing yourself. So I hope you can sort of bear with the fact that so far we haven't done much that's fun. So in the remaining lectures, I will start with attitude reports with proper names. There's some real sort of philosophical bite and interest there. And then in particular, I will move on. At first, it will be proper names for entities that exist, proper names of proper reference, and then we'll also look at an example involving this empty name Balkan. And as part of doing that, we'll become acquainted with something that I've said very little about so far, namely vicarious anchors. You populate these anchor sets, and then causal networks because of the way in which agents are connected via the vicarious anchor set form. So all that has to do with entity representations. And then I'll say a little bit about Hesperus phosphorus cases and like that, and a very little bit, I'm afraid, there won't be time, and it's hard to present, about the model theory of MSDRT. In the longer manuscript on the website, there is a chapter that's devoted to that, and it's quite long. And I can also say something again tomorrow. There will be a meeting for whoever wants to come at 10:30 in, I think it's salle 10 here in the Collège de France. So that's for people who just want to know more and have any other questions too. So I'll just be there, and whoever would like to come, please do. And then the fourth lecture, as announced, that will be about the role of all this, especially entity representations in fiction. Thank you.